Thank you all so much for being here virtually today. I'm Congresswoman Deb Haaland of New Mexico's 1st District. As the Vice Chair of the House Natural Resources Committee, I've convened this forum to discuss how we're preparing for wildfire during the coronavirus pandemic. I'd also like to acknowledge my fellow committee members who are participating and will be asking questions later on. Representative Jared Huffman from Northern California, Representative Mike Levin, representing Southern Orange County and Western San Diego counties in California, Representative Paul Tonko from New York, Representative Chuy Garcia from Illinois, and if we have additional members, of course, they'll be welcome to join. And I thank you to all of my colleagues for joining us today. I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. The last few months have spotlighted many existing inequalities in our society. Native American, Black, and Hispanic populations have made up a disproportionate share of those stricken by this terrible virus, and the first responders have been pushed to the limits trying to help their respective communities. An active wildfire year further threatens firefighters, healthcare workers, and vulnerable populations. Congress will continue to provide funding and other resources to ensure the safety of federal, state, and local firefighters. In the current fiscal year, Congress has appropriated $1.395 billion combined to the U.S. Forest Service and Department of Interior for wildfire suppression. An additional $2.25 billion in funding is available this year through a Wildfire Suppression Operations Reserve Fund. The House passed the HEROES Act, which I am proud to support, and would provide new state and local coronavirus relief funds to help first responders, healthcare workers, transit employees, teachers, and other workers providing vital services to all of our communities. The HEROES Act would provide $500 billion to states, $375 billion to local governments, and $20 billion to territories, and another $20 billion to Indian tribes, while clarifying that only federally recognized tribal governments are eligible for payments in the CARES and the HEROES Act. Our priority is to provide for the protection of at-risk communities and vulnerable populations. In a normal year, we suppress 98% of wildfire through the efforts of federal, state, and local fire and forestry departments. However, this is not a normal year. As climate change, wildfire, and coronavirus continue to present new challenges. Some of the questions at the top of my mind are what steps are being taken to keep firefighters healthy and limit the spread of the virus between first responders? How can a more aggressive initial response help limit smoke impacts and reduce the possibility of large fires? And when a wildfire does inevitably threaten a community or warrant an evacuation, how can families best protect their homes and their health? Because of these challenges, we need a coordinated response between federal and state governments, but we also need individuals and families to take responsibility for their role in preventing and preparing for wildfires. This means preparing for the possibility of wildfire, respecting land closures and burn bans intended to reduce the chances of starting a fire, and taking steps to mitigate wildfire impacts to our homes. Today, we will hear directly from state officials who work closely with federal partners, are prepared to deal with wildfire even as the coronavirus continues to impact our communities. We'll also hear about how at-risk communities and families can quickly improve wildfire resiliency through planning, preparedness, and mitigation. I'd now like to welcome our panelists. I appreciate all of you taking the time away from your normal duties in order to participate today. First, we have Ms. Laura McCarthy, State Forester from my home state of New Mexico. Next, we'll hear from Mr. Mike Morgan, Director of the Colorado Division of Fire Prevention and Control, from Chief Tom Porter, Director, California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection. And finally, we'll hear from Dr. Kimiko Barrett, a research and policy analyst at Headwaters Economics and the program manager for community planning assistance for wildfire. Ms. McCarthy, I'd like to recognize you first so that I can hear about the important work you're doing in New Mexico to protect communities while dealing with both wildfire and coronavirus.
Good afternoon, Chairman Howland and members of the committee. My name is Laura McCarthy, and I am the State Forester in New Mexico. I really appreciate the opportunity to participate in this forum about disasters colliding. My goal is to provide you with a perspective from New Mexico, which is already in the middle of a very active fire season. I'll start back 3 months ago, March 10, when our training with local volunteer firefighters was in full swing, along with hiring more than 300 emergency wildland firefighters. As of March 10th, we had had already more than 200 small fires, and our fire season seemed like it was off to a normal start. But then on March 11th, that brought the first report of confirmed cases of coronavirus in New Mexico. Things changed very rapidly for us from that point as we geared up to adapt our wildland fire policies and procedures to comply with Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham's executive and public health orders. Coronavirus has a cascading impact on wildland fire operations, as you will see as I walk you through our experience. First, we had to consider ways to screen firefighters for coronavirus before even mobilizing them to an incident. We had to consider test availability and the time delay for emergency response. We had to modify our training plans, forego large group training with local fire departments, and instead use online self-paced curriculum, and then schedule our work capacity field testing in small cohorts. The next concern was to adapt our fire management practices to avoid community spread among firefighters. We made changes to our procedures for transportation to incidents. We wrote instructions for dispersing camp operations so that modules would have separate sleeping and eating spaces from one another. We planned for virtual briefings, and then we started the planning for an incident within an incident. We started wrestling with these issues early in the pandemic because of the spring timing of our fire season. By April 10, now 2 months ago, the interagency wildland fire community was also deep into the same issues. Forest Service Chief Vicki Christensen's message emphasizing rapid response and fire suppression was very welcome news and helped ease some of the tensions between state and federal agencies. On May 10, before the ink was dry on the interagency guidance, we had our first real test. A human-caused wildfire in northern New Mexico sprang to life. We did not catch it on initial attack, and so we ordered a Type 3 incident command team. We put our policies into place, and we even added a new innovation to disinfect tools, vehicles, and other equipment that could potentially transmit the virus. We had employees self-assess, and we were quite pleased that some decided not to mobilize because of recent exposure. We put statewide fire restrictions in place to minimize additional human-caused fires. We were feeling that we'd passed the first test with a simple incident, but not so fast because the fire spotted and grew again, and when we remobilized resources, we had a firefighter develop coronavirus symptoms in the camp. Because of our new best practices, we kept that potential infection to 5 people. But the cycle started again when a firefighter from another agency had a positive test. Testing, tracing, waiting, wondering, and taking resources off the board. This is firefighting with coronavirus. With the background of this experience, I'll wrap up with 4 brief points that speak to the need for Congress to act to support wildland fire operations in this coronavirus pandemic. First, states and local governments need personal protective equipment, PPE. Preventing an incident within an incident is a new and critical priority for us. And this can be accomplished with emergency supplemental funding for the state fire assistance and volunteer fire assistance programs at a level 20% above the current appropriation. 2, sustained annual appropriations for volunteer fire assistance is also critical. We keep firefighters and the public safe with strong local initial attack close to home. State and local agencies are responsible for responding to 80% of the nation's wildfires on any jurisdiction. The VFA program supports fire departments in small rural communities, which often lack adequate resources. And because the equipment, training, and apparatus they need to fight wildland fire is so different from the gear they use for structure fires, this program allows them to bridge the gap. Third, to keep fires small, we also need the support of annual appropriations for state fire assistance, which prepares states for aggressive initial attack through activities that range from training to contracts for aircraft. And fourth, now is not the time to let up on prevention, and stimulus funds for fuels reduction and community protection will help rebuild rural economies. State fire assistance increases should also include funding for hazardous fuels reduction treatments to improve community safety, protect critical watersheds, and most importantly, reduce the impact of future wildfires. Many states will contribute funds to leverage federal dollars. For example, in New Mexico, we created a $2 million a year forest restoration fund to match the federal dollars. And fuels reduction stimulus will create jobs. Every 1 million of forest restoration generates 26 jobs in rural areas. So to conclude, the coronavirus is an added stress on our wildland fire operations. But with resources from Congress, our agencies can be, will be successful to protect the public, firefighters, and natural resources from catastrophic wildfire.
Thank you very much, Ms. McCarthy. And now we will go to Director Morgan. Director Morgan, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, well, I will jump in here. Thank you for having me here today. I really appreciate the opportunity to participate in this conversation. My name is Mike Morgan. I'm the Director of the Colorado Division of Fire Prevention and Control. I've been with the division for the past 4 years, and prior to that, I spent 30 years in a local fire department at Colorado River Fire Rescue in Garfield County. So I am familiar with the impacts locally at the state level, and we have significant relationships with all of our federal partners, like Ms. McCarthy alluded to. And I'm going to add some comments to things without being repetitive. I do echo much and all of what Ms. McCarthy said, but I also don't want to be competitive to the group. So I'd like to give just kind of a brief history of our wildfire problem in Colorado to kind of paint the picture of how we're preparing and continuing to adapt to a changing fire problem in our state. If you're to look at the 20 largest fires in Colorado's history, 5 of those fires, or 25% of the 20 largest fires, occurred in 2018 alone. 13 of the 20 largest fires we've ever experienced have occurred since 2010, which is 65% of the fires, and all 20 of the largest fires Colorado's ever have occurred since 2000. So we are seeing a significant increase in the number of fires and the complexities. Added to that, the wildland-urban interface issues in Colorado are significant and a growing problem there too, with about 50% of our population living within the wildland-urban interface. For this year, Fire Predictive Service forecasts indicate that we can anticipate an average fire season for portions of the state, while some portions like the south, southwest, and western parts of our state are predicted to have an above-average fire season. To put that a little bit into perspective for everybody, on an average fire season, we will have about 4,800 fires that burn about 180,000 acres for an average. So we anticipate to be at least that busy and probably more busy with that. Like Ms. McCarthy alluded to, we've been planning with our federal and local partners for months on mitigating the impacts of COVID and how that response changes given the pandemic environment. Real quickly, as an overview, Colorado is a strong local control state, and as such, the fire chief, the way statute reads, is the fire chief is responsible for a fire until it exceeds his or her capability. Once it exceeds that capability, which could be staffing, could be money, could be resources, it could be technical expertise. All of those things can play into those factors. But once that occurs, the authority to manage the fire goes to the county sheriff, and then has the same scenario that they assume that control until it exceeds his or her capabilities, at which time that it goes to the director of the Division of Fire Prevention and Control. So our division, the Division of Fire Prevention and Control, we are the lead fire management agency for the state of Colorado. The other complexity, as I kind of alluded to earlier, but fires in Colorado change significantly in that our fires are now in the wildland urban interface or with values at risk or critical infrastructure, and it's now evolved to be as much, if not more, of a public safety problem, in addition to the traditional natural resource and watershed threats. Given the wildland urban interface, the tourist reliance, and the fact that about 40 million people across the country rely on Colorado for the water supply, fire has become a much broader impact than simply a fire in the mountains, as it seemed to be in years past. Given our fire occurrence and our risks, we've recognized that the duration of an event correlates directly with the impact of an event. So the costs related, the risks associated to life and property, economies, et cetera, are all directly tied to the duration or the length of an event as it's allowed to occur. So the more that this event occurs, the higher the impact. And so we're trying to do a lot of work to make sure that we catch those fires, especially those threatening, to catch those early on. And mitigation has been talked about, prevention, suppression, training, education. All of those things play a role in keeping the duration of an event small. Now, most of you are all aware that from time to time we try to allow fire to be managed for resource benefit and those types of things, depending on complexities. When you add the complexities of coronavirus and COVID into that equation, that just comes off the table. That is not even an option. The risks are just too great. So we're right now operating under a premise even more aggressively than normal that state assistance, if you will, is a better approach to everybody incurred than waiting for state responsibility to fire. We're trying to lean forward with resources and assistance at the local level with our resources as best as we can, and we've done a lot of work to do that. So the statutes in Colorado require myself to put together a preparedness plan, which I do every spring, and I present that to the governor, the General Assembly, and then it's released to the public. I provided a copy of that wildfire preparedness plan, as well as an executive summary of that plan to your staff so that you had that for review if you care to take a look at that. But the plan was developed under some assumptions that COVID will definitely have impacts on the 2020 wildfire season, and we are seeing those impacts already. So with that, we know that we want to reduce fire occurrence. That's the public education component, and working with our local agencies to make sure people understand the risks associated. We also are operating under the assumption that local resources are not as available as in normal seasons they would be. The impacts of exposed or quarantined or sick from COVID are having significant impacts and will continue to have some significant impacts throughout our fire season. We can also assume that extended fire attack or long duration events increases the risk to firefighter health and safety, as well as then ultimately to the risk to the public. We are operating under the concept that we have no wanted fires in 2020, and traditional fire camp environments should be avoided if at all possible. So during this process, we did a risk analysis to evaluate resources that are under Colorado's operational control rather than the traditional geographical area control in that approach. So we started some contingency plans accordingly. On page 2 of the summary I provided throws out some of those things that we presented to the governor's contingency plans, and we worked through some of those going forward, and we've landed on what we've actually done to change our ability and our approach to a rapid initial attack. So for what we've implemented so far is we've started, and we have exclusive use single engineer tankers and exclusive use helicopters that we use on a regular basis every year. We have brought those resources on early this year, and we anticipate keeping them later into the season. In addition to that, we've replenished what we call the Wildfire Emergency Response Fund. The Wildfire Emergency Response Fund provides for 2 days of a hand crew, and the first water drops from an aircraft, that the state will pay for those. As was alluded to by Ms. McCarthy, a lot of the local agencies, the budgets, the constraints they have, we know that often those decisions are, can we afford, or do we think we can actually catch a fire? If we have 10 more minutes, can we catch it? We know that we've lost multiple fires in years past as a result of that. So we try to proactively provide the availability of these resources.
Director,
Yes, ma'am.
Director Morgan, thank you so much. We have a schedule to keep, and so thank you so much. I appreciate your testimony. We will get to some of those questions as our members have a chance to ask. Okay, thank you so much. So we'll go to Director Tom Porter. Director Porter, you have 5 minutes.
Chair Holland and representatives, I'm very pleased to be in front of you today. And I'm the director of CAL FIRE, also the state forester for the Department of Forestry and Fire Protection for CAL FIRE. My colleagues covered a lot of ground that I need not rehash. I do echo all of their concerns and the issues that they've brought forward. I will talk specifically to California's preparedness. Wildfires in California are a natural part of the landscape. In recent years, we've seen more large and destructive fires than any other time in recorded history. And a lot of that is due to drought conditions brought on by low rates of winter storm and precipitation, as well as changing climate. So what we're doing to mitigate impacts of wildland fire and the COVID pandemic to our response is to work with my colleagues that are on this call or this meeting, as well as the state foresters from across the nation and fire managers, as well as our federal counterparts, to build methods and protocols to protect the public, as you've heard in previous testimony, vulnerable communities, as well as protect firefighters from infection and have plans in the event that infections do occur. So first, the public. The public is our most important ally in this. We need to prevent wildfires. Most wildfires are caused by humans, and humans can make that not happen. They can stop that cause. We are working with all of the residents of California to ensure that their defensible space is maintained and ready to go this year. That is the space that allows firefighters to work around homes when fire's coming, but also makes them more defendable and standalone capable when fires do come and there aren't firefighters to put at those homes. Hardening of homes, making sure that low-cost retrofits, screening of vents and window coverings and different things are made whole before the season really gets going. And we're just now turning that corner into the season. We also released a defensible space self-assessment survey that can be done online and then uploaded so that our defensible space inspectors that are going around the country looking at the defensible space issues know where to look and how to tune their review. We have our website, readyforwildfire.org, coupled with our app, Ready for Wildfire, and those two have digital tools that landowners can use to make sure that they're on track and getting all of this pre-work done. Secondly, protecting vulnerable communities. In 2019, January of 2019, Governor Gavin Newsom asked me to develop a report, a community wildfire prevention and mitigation report. And we did so. The department and our sister departments throughout the state to really look at how we could reduce the impacts to to vulnerable communities, those that are most vulnerable in California, both socioeconomically as well as situationally on the landscape. And we did so. One of the things that came out of that report was 35 priority projects need to get done. We did that. We got those done last year. Some of them carried into this spring, but all 35 of those projects are in place to protect those vulnerable communities, of which there are about 200 communities protected by those 35 projects. We also work hard with our land use planning group to ensure that local governments are looking at planning elements and updating their safety elements of their general plans to ensure that future development and current development is meeting those building standards. Finally, protecting our personnel. Very important, and Director Morgan covered a lot of it, as well as State Forester Laura McCarthy. What I wanted to focus on in the California setting is we're just entering into our large fire season. Kind of peak season starts now and goes through the end of October into November traditionally. We will continue to look at ways to reduce our large incidents and the need for large base camps. That's going to be the most critical thing through aggressive initial attack. And we will make sure that when we're doing our briefings that we're using every piece of technology that we possibly can, including digital platforms for briefings, and then fighting fire, unfortunately, is a dirty business that really is hands-on, and firefighter strategies and tactics will largely remain unchanged. It is a hands-on effort that requires hard work and boots on the ground to put fires out. And so the key for all of us, and we'll continue to work with our state foresters and federal partners as well, but the key for all of us is to have aggressive initial attack, keep fires small, keep the exposure to firefighters to a minimum, and keep that same exposure of pollutants in the air and the possibility of having to be congregations of people in sheltering locations to a minimum.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Director Porter. Thank you very much. We appreciate your testimony. And next we'll go to Dr. Barrett. And Dr. Barrett, welcome. And you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Holland and members of the committee. Wildfires are inevitable, yet the disasters they yield do not have to be. After more than a century of structured fire management and decades of research, we know a lot about wildfires. We understand more about their behavior on the landscape, how a home burns down, and how through a single ignition source an entire community is threatened. We also know that wildfires are increasing in frequency and severity, and that at the same time, more homes are being built in wildfire-prone areas. And we have seen how the impacts of wildfire disproportionately affect the most vulnerable populations, who may not have the physical or economic means to prepare, respond, recover, and rebuild. Unfortunately, many of the people most vulnerable to wildfires are also most vulnerable to the coronavirus pandemic. The elderly, lower-income families, the disabled, and those who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color. These populations may experience challenges with mobility, making evacuation difficult. They may suffer from health complications, further aggravated by wildfire smoke. They may experience economic instability that makes preparing for and recovering from a wildfire disaster more problematic. And they may face institutional barriers to physical and economic recovery. For populations at risk, the impacts from wildfires, coupled with the coronavirus, will exacerbate existing inequalities. And while we are just beginning to understand the new and onerous challenges of wildfires, of the coronavirus, rather, we have a wealth of science, resources, and best practices to reduce wildfire risks. We know how to build homes and plan communities to live with wildfire. With this aim, I want to share with you two new exciting resources. The first is the Community Planning Assistance for Wildfire program, created by Headwaters Economics and in partnership with Wildfire Planning International and the U.S. Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station. This program provides communities with land use planning recommendations, customized research tools, local hazard mapping, and capacity trainings to better understand and plan the wildland-urban interface. Our work underscores the need to anticipate and envision the inevitability of wildfires. It is not possible, nor is it safe to assume that we can extinguish all wildfires. Individual homeowners and local governments must act now and ready themselves for a wildfire before it occurs, especially during the pandemic. For example, and as mentioned by the other panelists and Director Porter himself, residents are able to practice stay-at-home measures, can carry out many preventative steps to make their wildfire-resistant home increase. The relatively simple and affordable tasks can reduce wildfire risks, such as safely storing combustible material like firewood away from the home, trimming trees and vegetation within 100 feet of any structure, replacing wood mulch with rock mulch in garden beds, removing leaves and debris from the roofs and the gutters, and hardening vulnerable features of the home with ignition-resistant building materials. These basic measures increase the survivability of a home during a wildfire, and especially important during a pandemic, allow firefighters and first responders to address other urgent needs. The second resource I want to share with you is Wildfire Risk to Communities website, a brand new nationwide tool that for the first time ever maps and identifies wildfire risk at the community level. Wildfire Risk to Communities provides easy-to-use interactive maps and resources to help communities understand, explore, and reduce risk. Created in response to the 2018 Omnibus Act, Wildfire Risk to Communities was developed in partnership with the U.S. Forest Service Research, Pyrologics, and Headwaters Economics. The website provides detailed information about wildfire risk to homes and vulnerable populations for any selected community, while also offering resources to address and mitigate that risk. Make no doubt about it, managing wildfires under the veil and burden of a pandemic will not be easy. Vulnerable populations will be especially hard hit by the dual impacts of wildfire and the coronavirus. Yet of these two crises, we already have the knowledge and experience to prepare for and reduce the risk from wildfire. This is a solvable problem. We know how to build communities to survive a wildfire. Communities need help though, particularly during times of pandemic and economic hardship. I encourage you to support and expand prevention and planning efforts to increase the safety of communities, vulnerable populations, and our firefighting forces before a wildfire becomes a disaster. Thank you, Chairwoman.
Thank you so much. And now we will open up to member questions and appreciate all of you being here. My colleague, Congressman Joe Neguse from Colorado, he is trying to juggle his place on the Judiciary Committee hearing as well. So I would like to give him the first opportunity to ask questions. So I recognize Congressman Joe Neguse.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Hopefully you can see me all right there on the screen.
Yes, we can.
Oh, wonderful. Oh, great. Thank you so much, Chair Howland, for your indulgence. As you mentioned, we're participating in a judiciary hearing as well today. I want to thank our witnesses for participating in today's virtual forum. And again, thank Chair Howland for hosting this important forum. I represent Colorado's 2nd Congressional District, so I am particularly grateful for the work of Director Morgan. It's good to see him, who of course is a Colorado native and leads the Colorado Division of Fire Prevention and Control. I want to thank you, Director Morgan, for the life-saving and critically important work that you do to keep my constituents and those throughout our home state safe. As Director Morgan knows and of course testified to, Colorado is a state that is constantly addressing the risk of wildfire, and as the population of our state continues to grow, that risk really does increase along with it. The indicia of a pandemic on top of this growing risk makes the situation even more dire, as we must both protect communities from fire and respiratory impacts of wildfire smoke, and also protect our brave firefighters who are working in close quarters to save lives. I would be remiss if I didn't mention a bill that myself and Representative John Curtis, my Republican colleague from Utah, have been working on since the beginning of the onset of COVID-19, a Wildfire and Community Health Response Act, which would require the U.S. Forest Service and the BLM to report to Congress their plans to address the current and future fire seasons during this pandemic, while also keeping their personnel safe. And of course, that work is even more important when one considers the potential for a second wave, perhaps later this year. As Congress continues our work to tackle these challenges, of course, I'm grateful to all of our panelists for their hard work at the state level in coordinating emergency response during such a critical moment for our nation. Director Morgan, I wanted to ask you a question, which first, just again, thank you for your participation, but I wanted to ask you a question about our state's interactions with FEMA. It was an issue of orders of PPE to local fire chiefs. My office promptly, requested additional answers from FEMA on this issue. We had a very productive call with the FEMA regional administrator as a result. But of course, it's something that we continue actually in April during a call that I had with local fire chiefs to get updates on how COVID-19 was affecting wildfire risk in my district. And on that call, I learned that some local chiefs had run into issues acquiring PPE for their personnel, those issues, and if so, what you think Congress can do to ensure that our firefighters are receiving the PPE that they need to stay safe.
Representative, thank you, and I appreciate the question. And yes, to your question, I think early on, the availability of personal protective equipment was a critical issue, that there was a shortage, that there was a lot of fire chiefs and ambulance services, of course, which most, as you know, in Colorado are fire-based, that were experiencing a shortage of personal protective equipment. That has stabilized somewhat. We get on, we meet basically the State Fire Chiefs Association and myself. We have a bi-weekly call. We talk twice a week to discuss those issues, and it seems to have stabilized for the time being. But as you've alluded to, that second wave, I think everybody is concerned about that and being able to make sure that the long supply line, that is stabilized for the long haul.
Well, thank you, Director Morgan, and appreciate your feedback. And we'll certainly stay vigilant on that particular issue here in the coming months, because, of course, there's nothing more important than ensuring that your folks have the necessary PPE that they need to, of course, keep us all safe in the Rocky Mountain West and really indeed across our country. With the limited time I have left, I guess I would just want to offer this one conclusory note, which is to say that it's clear both from the extent of your testimony and I think just in general, what we see in terms of facts on the ground, that our local governments are very much struggling right now, as are our state governments, in light of the economic shortfall, the revenue shortfalls that they've experienced because of the economic disruption caused by COVID-19. And so I am hopeful that the progress we've made, for example, in the HEROES Act, where we secured $375 billion for our local governments and state governments so that they can continue to provide critical services like firefighting services. I'm hopeful that that will ultimately get across the finish line. And I know me and my colleagues are certainly going to be working towards that end each and every day here. So again, thank you all for your participation. Thank you, Chair Howland, for your indulgence, and I look forward to the remaining questions from other members.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Congressman Neguse. Next, we will go to Congressman Tonko. Congressman Tonko, are you ready to ask your questions?
You hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yeah, now we can see you.
Hey, it gets better and better. Thank you, Chair Howland, for what I think is a very important discussion. Thank you for hosting us with this roundtable. And thank you to all our experts for joining us today. The panel clearly shows how important our state and local partners are in keeping Americans safe. Unfortunately, over the last few months, the federal level hasn't really held up its end of the bargain. The current administration has put an enormous amount of responsibility, I believe, on state and local governments to combat COVID-19, but none of the tools to do so. In fact, they've done the opposite, with Leader McConnell going so far as to suggest that my home state, New York, should just go and file for bankruptcy. Given this context, like many others here, I'm interested to know if your agencies are locally prepared for taking on the roles of COVID era activity and what might need to change. But the one thing that I wanted to ask Director Morgan, with the indication that we expect more the projected increase in fires, what is driving that?
Congressman, thank you for the question. I think there's a lot of factors that are driving that. Has been alluded to, the changing temperatures, the longer fire seasons, all of those things are playing an impact. I won't pretend to be a scientist and get into a a conversation about global warming and those types of issues, but we do know that our fire seasons have changed significantly and they are growing. We also know that the wildland urban interface problem is worse than it's ever been in most of the western states. As well as we know that the forest health as a whole is problematic. Colorado used to be referred to as the asbestos forest, and that is not the case we have now. We're seeing fires burning at 10,000 foot in elevation 2 weeks after where there was snow drifts where you couldn't get in before. And so I think it's a combination of a lot of things that we have a fuels problem, we have a heat problem, we have an ignition problem, and all those factors come together that have created some extreme complexities in putting a burden on local governments, state governments, and even federal governments across the board as it relates to fire and fire management.
Thank you. I have to acknowledge that immediately my thoughts went to climate change. And as you suggest, it could be part of it. I'd like now to turn to another crucially important issue, and that is the intersection between environmental health and public health. It had become extremely clear as of late that COVID-19 fatality rates are very closely linked to respiratory health. Large-scale fires can certainly decimate the regional air quality, which could easily exacerbate the prevalence of COVID-19 fatalities. So how are your agencies taking additional steps both to prevent such large-scale air quality disruptions and to, if necessary, warn and protect potentially affected populations should a large-scale fire occur? Anyone?
I guess, Congressman, I'll throw out just a couple of things, that we're doing. Of course, we're trying to make sure, as we all know, a lot of these resources we compete with nationally. So we're trying to really make sure that we have the ability to have operational control of additional resources and aggressive initial attack. We know fires are going to occur, and so it's how we address them early on. The other piece is the traditional mass sheltering, which was kind of talked about earlier. We want to avoid that at all costs. So we're working with our Office of Emergency Management, with the Division of Insurance, so that in the event we get into these evacuation scenarios, that we can provide sheltering in hotels or those types of an environment, rather than in the traditional mass sheltering environment. As well as we're trying to make sure that's coordinated, because we know with the large fire camps, we'll be doing the same types of activities, and we don't want to have folks that have been evacuated competing for the same hotel space that firefighters and incident management teams are competing for. So it's added a whole level of complexity in an attempt to really protect that vulnerable population, which is throwing obviously some significant challenges for us.
Thank you. And any other thoughts? I think my time is exhausted. If you could just get back to the committee, if any of you had thoughts on this as witnesses.
Thank you.
Okay, with that, I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, Congressman. So happy to have you here.
Thank you.
Next, I will yield 5 minutes to my colleague, Mike Levin of California.
Well, thank you very much, Chair Holland, for convening this meeting today. It's good to see my colleagues, and particularly grateful for the leadership of Chief Porter and everyone on the front lines in California. Quite concerned with wildfires in our state, in my district, in the heart of my district. And recently I met with a professor at UC San Diego to discuss wildfire management during the pandemic. And during the discussion, we focused on the need to catch wildfires early before they become more difficult to suppress. He shared that early confirmation of a wildfire in the incipient or growth stage is the best way to contain or control a newly developed wildfire so that it doesn't grow beyond the reach of available fire crews. But a question for you, Chief, and for anybody else that wants to weigh in, would early confirmation of wildfires help you more effectively reduce the damage and save lives and protect our environment?
Congressman, thank you for that question. And there's been a massive expansion of our fidelity on the landscape through Alert Wildfire and the cameras that are out there. Those are helpful for monitoring. For detection, we're utilizing both satellite and aerial surveillance that identifies when starts occur. Particularly, these are good for remote areas, but we do still rely on the public. And when you see smoke, we need you to call 911 and get that lodged, because it's not a certainty that somebody's seen it on a camera or that the satellites have picked up the fire yet. So those are all super important. And then in California, we're blessed with a large fleet of state-owned aircraft that respond to wildfires throughout the state. We also have our local government partners that have helicopters that do the same. In the case of the base, actually, the Marine Corps has buckets, and they do also drop water on their own fires. So we have a really good aerial fleet that keeps fires typically in a smaller fashion, so we can put boots on the ground and put them out, like I was mentioning.
I wanted to follow up on the alert wildfire cameras. I've heard a lot about them, and I'm quite impressed by everything that I've heard. And there seems to be some evidence that points to their effectiveness in San Diego County, as an example. Since the alert wildfire camera system was installed, there's been no loss of life due to fire and no fires larger than 5,000 acres. So Chief Porter, would you agree it's been an effective and worthwhile investment?
It's absolutely an effective investment, and it needs to be also acknowledged that the network is fed by those that are purchasing and putting up cameras, from private business to institutions like the educational institutions, as well as the governor's investment through CAL FIRE in 100 additional cameras in the more remote areas of the state that didn't have that capability previously. Absolute important investment in our fidelity of what's going on and monitoring.
And do you think it would be a valuable investment for us to deploy a network of wildfire detection cameras on federal lands throughout California and across the country, similar to the efforts you've already started in California?
Yes, I do. And it needs to be said also that some of our cameras are on federal lands and looking at federal lands as well. So there's a mutual investment that's occurring in the regions, and I would encourage that to be a nationwide expansion.
Thank you again, Chief. I was wondering if any of other witnesses from the other states had anything to add on your experiences with wildfire detection cameras, or any other thoughts about the use of those systems on federal lands?
Yes, sir. I'd like to add something, Madam Chairman and Representative. The New Mexico-based company Descartes Labs has piloted a different system of satellite detection of wildfire that generates early alerts that I receive on my phone along with all of my fire staff. These are based on satellites that are passing over the Earth on 5-minute intervals. And we are finding it to be an extremely effective supplement to the tools that we were already using.
Thank you very much. I'm out of time, Chair Holland. I want to thank you again for convening our panel today. Look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Congressman. So happy to have you here. Next, we will go to Congressman Soto. Congressman Soto, are you available to ask your questions?
Yes.
Wonderful.
Thanks, Madam Chairwoman. And first, let me start by saying, even in Florida, we can get some wildfires. I know we have a lot more water out in the southeast than in much of the Rocky Mountain West and far west. But as many of you may know, we have dry seasons the first couple of months of each year, and had a wildfire in 2017 in the south part of my district that took days to put out. So we certainly stand in solidarity with those of our brothers and sisters in the West. My first question is back to some issues related to the HEROES Act, which is, we're deeply concerned that many of you can face budget cuts that'll make it even more difficult on top of the COVID-19 response that you're having to deal with to address wildfire. So it'd be great to hear from Ms. McCarthy, Mr. Morgan, and Mr. Porter on what budget cuts you may face in your various respective states if we're not able to pass the HEROES Act and plug in those budget gaps, and what would that mean for our responses? I know most budgets are starting in the beginning of July, so it'd be great to hear from y'all. We'll start with Ms. McCarthy. How's that?
Okay. Yes, Madam Chair and Representative, that's a great and very, very timely question. Our Legislative Finance Committee is meeting today to be working out the details of the cuts that are going to come for us in New Mexico. We are a fairly unique state agency in that among the 50 state forestry agencies in the nation, in that our workforce is already very small, and we rely extremely heavily on the federal funding that we pass through to the local volunteer fire departments in order to supplement our own resources. We really work together as a team, and we put most of our energy into training and then mobilization to effectively put the right person in the right place during our fire season so that we can catch fires while they're small. So any diminishment of the federal support for the volunteer fire assistance, for the state fire assistance, is going to be immediately felt in New Mexico's rural communities.
Thank you. Mr. Morgan, followed by Mr. Porter. Any potential cuts that you face, and how important would that be to pass the HEROES Act to avoid those for your mission?
Thank you, Congressman. Right now, of course, I think it's all a moving target for all of us of what those budget cuts are actually going to look like. We're hearing anything from 10% to 30% budget cuts for us, which really causes us to have conversations about what are the most essential of the essential services that are provided out there. And it becomes extremely challenging because we find ourselves in that predicament, and we know in this business, and I think everybody on this committee understands, that sometimes if you save a dime or two by cutting a public safety budget or a response to fire capability, that's going to cost you several dollars down the road in the cost for large fires. So we're looking at a lot of those things, and I'll pass to Chief here in just a minute, but just a couple other things that along those lines is the camera, the alert systems. We have looked at that. There was legislation being proposed in Colorado to do similar types of efforts. That has now died as a result of the fiscal impacts related with that program. We're very big into early detection. We know that's proven itself. We have a multi-mission aircraft. We know that we've saved millions by spending a few dollars up front. And that's going to become more and more challenging in our ability to support local governments who are equally impacted. And if we don't have a state and federal resources to support them to catch these fires when they're small, it's going to cost us more in the long run.
Thanks. Chief Porter? You're on mute.
Using your seconds. Thank you for the question. Yes, the state is expecting about a $54 billion shortfall, which is going to affect all aspects of state government application. What I want to say about our budget for wildland firefighting for this year, I think we are not going to see significant cuts in our capabilities, but what I'm worried about is out years. This year, I think we're going to be okay for this season. Out years concerned.
Thanks. Now yield back.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Congressman. Thank you. Happy to have you here. And now I will recognize myself for 5 minutes. Ms. McCarthy, New Mexico might be ahead of the game in some regards, since their drier climate means you've already dealt with several recent fires. Has there been anything unexpected about how the coronavirus has impacted your ability to respond to or prepare for wildfire?
In a sense, Madam Chair and members, it's all unexpected. really down the line, the entire process of responding to wildfire has had to be rethought. And we found ourselves in the early days, and of course, Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham is very, very serious about social distancing. And in a matter of 2 days, we transformed our organization from an office-based organization to a telework organization, including all of our fire operations. And then immediately after that, we started really cycling through each step of training, responding, deploying people to incidents, how they interact while they're at the incidents, and then the follow-up, because and maybe this is perhaps the most surprising thing, is that even after the incident ends, because of the 14-day incubation period, we have found ourselves dealing with the implications of a firefighter who left a fire after it was over, found a positive test 5, 6, 7, 10 days later, and then having to deal with the cascade of effects of quarantining every individual or arranging for testing for this exponential impact on our resources that we are having to develop systems. And we did have a really positive breakthrough this week, working with New Mexico's Department of Health to arrange and streamline testing so that the next time we have an incident within an incident, even if it's after the fact of the incident, we'll have much better testing protocols and systems in place.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Let's see. I wanted to go to Dr. Barrett. Dr. Barrett, we've heard a lot about how the states are preparing for wildfire, but when my constituents ask what they can do, you've already given us some advice, and it's good advice. I wanted to give you an opportunity to just, expand your list or talk more in detail about what you think we should all be addressing when we're talking about this issue.
Yes, thank you, Chairwoman Holland. Absolutely, the individual homeowner can do quite a bit to, again, mitigate their home and make it more ignition resistant. It's already been reflected on by the other panelists, Director Porter and others, and Chief Morgan, that the defensible space of the home and property can play a significant role in reducing vulnerabilities, primarily from ignition sources coming from firebrands or embers. Embers result in a majority of home ignitions. And so if you can reduce opportunities for those embers to ignite small individual spot fires, which can grow and lead to the entire destruction of a home, and then prevent home-to-home ignition, you can dramatically reduce risk to the community at large. So things such as managing the vegetation is certainly a big piece. Very importantly, managing and reducing vulnerabilities within 5 feet of the structure can play a large role. Research found by our colleagues at Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, as well as the Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station, show that hardening the home itself, including the siding, the decking, the roof, the windows, all of that can play a large role, again, in reducing the vulnerabilities of ignition sources, primarily from embers. And that is something that homeowners who are able to stay at home right now can do relatively simply and easily, as well as affordably. Thank you, Chairwoman.
Thank you also. And it looks like my time is just about up too, so I will yield back the few seconds I have and just want to say thank you to everyone who participated. I'd like to thank all my colleagues who joined us today and all of the panelists. Your testimony gave us some valuable insights on the work that you're doing and the directions we should go as we work on the wildfire issues in Congress. We're grateful to all of you for the work you do every single day to keep our forests healthy, to keep our friends and families safe, and we appreciate you being out there on the front lines. Thank you all so much. This virtual forum is now adjourned. Thank you so much for joining us.